What if I told you a Hollywood legend walked into an MMA gym right after a coach slapped a teenager for lying about Navy SEALs? And it turned out the kid might have been telling the truth. The gym was bustling with energy on a Tuesday afternoon. The rhythmic sound of heavy bags being struck, the sharp slap of feet hitting the mat, and the occasional grunt of exertion filled the air. This was the world of Coach Greg, an MMA instructor who ran his small gym with precision and discipline. It wasn't the biggest or the most well-known gym in town, but it was respected by the local fighting community. Greg had trained some of the top fighters in the region over the years. But even more important to him than the fight was the respect he demanded from those who came to learn. On this particular day, there was a new face in the gym, a teenager named Alex. Alex wasn't yet a fighter, but he had been talking about wanting to learn mixed martial arts for months. His wide-eyed enthusiasm and a desire to be around people who seemed tough and intimidating brought him in. But it was clear he still had a lot to prove. His story was the typical one for someone his age. The desire to prove oneself, the desire to be seen as strong, the desire to fit in. Alex was a tall, gangly kid, awkward in his movements, but with an eager, almost desperate energy. He didn't exactly fit in with the older fighters, many of whom had seen real combat in the gym, or, for a few, had fought professionally. Some had military backgrounds, while others were just seasoned street fighters who had turned to the cage. But Alex didn't know how to gauge the respect these men and women had earned, and in his desire to show off, he made a mistake. It happened when Coach Greg called for a break. The gym paused as the athletes wiped sweat from their brows, stretched their legs, and sipped water. Alex stood in the corner, overhearing some of the older guys discussing their recent training sessions or comparing notes on their conditioning. Feeling the heat of the moment, he couldn't resist inserting himself into the conversation. "I'm not exactly new to this, you know," Alex said casually, speaking to no one in particular, but hoping to be overheard. The older fighters glanced at him, mildly curious, but not giving him their full attention. "My uncle's the one who trained Navy SEALs," Alex continued, leaning back against the wall, as though he had just revealed some incredible secret. His voice was full of pride, and it was clear he expected his listeners to be impressed. There was an almost imperceptible pause before the room continued buzzing with conversation. But Alex, not sensing the slight doubt in the air, pressed on. "He trained dozens of them," Alex said, his tone growing more animated. "He's the one who taught them all those crazy techniques. You know, the ones you see in those super-secret training camps." At this point, Coach Greg, who had been standing with a few of his regular fighters by the rings, turned his attention to Alex. The gym, while a place of learning, was also a place for discipline. Greg was used to hearing some exaggerations here and there, especially from the younger crowd, but there was something in the way Alex spoke, his complete lack of self-awareness, that rubbed Greg the wrong way. "Your uncle, huh?" Greg asked, his voice quiet but filled with a level of curiosity that didn't entirely conceal his skepticism. "What's his name?" Alex looked around the gym, searching for approval. A few of the fighters had stopped talking and turned their attention toward him. His name is Jake," Alex said, his face glowing with the attention he was getting. "Jake Thompson. You won't find anything about him online. He's too deep in the game to ever make it to the press. But he's the real deal. I'm telling you. He trained SEALs all over the world." The older fighters exchanged glances. A few chuckled under their breath. Others just looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Greg, however, took a step closer, narrowing his eyes as he listened. It wasn't the claim about an unknown uncle training Navy SEALs that bothered him. It was the disrespect that it implied. Greg had served in the military before getting into MMA, and he had spent years training with and around real combatants. There was a deep respect he had for those who serve in the armed forces, especially elite groups like the Navy SEALs. "And where did he train them?" Greg asked, crossing his arms, his voice a little firmer now. Alex, clearly caught off guard by the question, faltered for a moment. In these remote locations," he said quickly, trying to cover his tracks. "He's got these camps all over the world. You won't find them on any map. They're top secret." Greg's brow furrowed. Something about this entire conversation was beginning to feel wrong. The gym was full of seasoned fighters, some of whom had been through extensive training programs themselves. They could smell a fishy story from a mile away. So, your uncle is out there training Navy SEALs in these undisclosed camps, but he never gets any recognition? Greg's tone grew more pointed now. No interviews, no articles, no nothing. Alex hesitated, and then with a mixture of defiance and desperation, he said, "Look, I know what I'm talking about. I've heard the stories. He's trained more SEALs than you can count. I'm telling you, you wouldn't believe the things he's taught them." By now, the other fighters were clearly growing tired of the nonsense. Greg had seen enough. The gym had always been about respect. Respect for your opponent, for the art of fighting, and for those who served in the military, who put their lives on the line. What Alex was doing wasn't just lying. It was disrespecting the very people who had earned their place in the world of combat. "All right, kid," Greg said, his voice growing cold. "Enough of this crap." Alex, feeling emboldened by the attention, stood his ground. "What, you don't believe me?" Without another word, Greg moved toward Alex, his face hardening. Alex, still too young and naive to understand the seriousness of the situation, defiantly held his ground. The room seemed to go still as Greg stopped directly in front of him. Then, in one swift motion, Greg raised his hand and slapped Alex across the face. It wasn't a punch, but it was hard enough to make a point. The sound of the slap echoed through the gym, leaving the room in stunned silence. Alex stumbled back, blinking in shock as the sting of the slap spread across his cheek. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, he just stood there, dazed and confused. The other fighters, who'd been watching this exchange unfold, were equally silent. Some of them looked away, unsure how to react, while others stood with wide eyes, taking in the unexpected turn of events. Greg, however, didn't flinch. He wasn't a man to back down from a confrontation, especially when it came to respecting those who deserved it. His jaw tightened, and he stared Alex down. "Don't ever talk about things you don't understand," Greg said quietly but firmly. "You don't get to lie about people who risk their lives for real." Alex, now flushed with humiliation and anger, tried to recover his composure. "You'll regret doing that," he spat, still trying to save face. Before Greg could respond, however, the gym's door swung open, and in walked a figure that no one could have expected, Richard Gere. The famous actor, best known for his roles in films like Pretty Woman and An Officer and a Gentleman, strolled into the gym as if he owned the place. The chatter in the room paused immediately as everyone turned to look. "Richard Gere," someone whispered in disbelief. Alex, still reeling from the slap, stared at the actor, too stunned to respond. Greg, who had been prepared to give Alex a lesson in respect, was momentarily distracted by the unexpected arrival. "Hey, is this a good time for a training session?" Richard Gere asked casually, completely unaware of the tension that had just unfolded in the gym. He didn't seem at all fazed by the scene he was walking into. His demeanor was cool and relaxed, almost as if he were stepping into a friend's house, not a fighter's gym. The gym was in a complete state of shock now. Alex's claims about his uncle's SEAL training had been met with a slap, and now, of all people, Richard Gere was standing in the doorway, ready to train. The gym stood frozen. You could have heard a pin drop if it weren't for the rhythmic hum of the industrial ceiling fan and the distant whine of a jump rope hitting the mat in the back. Richard Gere's entrance had knocked the air out of the room like a well-timed jab. He looked completely out of place and yet oddly comfortable at the same time. Dressed in a black jacket, dark jeans, and a gray t-shirt, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who'd long ago stopped needing to prove himself to anyone. The kind of quiet power that Coach Greg, even with all his years in the cage, recognized instantly. Everyone was still trying to figure out why the hell Richard Gere, had just walked into a beat-up MMA gym in the suburbs. Greg narrowed his eyes, wiping the sweat from his brow as he stepped forward. "Mr. Gere," he asked, blinking in disbelief. "Yeah," Richard said with an easy smile. "Heard this was the place to come if you want the real thing." No one spoke. Some of the younger fighters fumbled for their phones, unsure whether to snap a picture or just stand there slack-jawed. Greg, for once in his life, didn't know what to say. This was a man who'd sparred with champions, served in Iraq, broken ribs and noses without flinching, But now Richard Gere was shaking his hand. Behind them, Alex stood frozen, the red handprint still fresh across his face. His mouth was half open, but no words came. The chaos he'd created moments earlier was instantly overshadowed. He couldn't decide if he should run or bow or explain himself. But before he could even process what was happening, Richard turned to him. "You must be Alex," he said. His voice was warm, familiar. He said the teen's name like he already knew him. Alex blinked. Yeah, I'm Alex." Coach Greg raised an eyebrow. "You two know each other?" Richard looked at Alex and gave him a small, knowing nod. "Not personally, but I knew his uncle." Now that caught everyone's attention. Greg's face tightened. "Hold on. Are you saying this kid wasn't lying? His uncle actually trained Navy SEALs." Gere's smile faded a little, replaced by something quieter. He wasn't lying. Not entirely. His uncle, Jake Thompson, was the real deal. He was a Tier 1 operator. Black Ops, deep field training. I met him on a film set years ago while preparing for a role in the flock. They had him consulting with us on movement and close-quarters combat for a character I was playing. Greg looked over at Alex, who stood there blinking like he'd just found out the tooth fairy was real. So that story was true? Gere took a deep breath. Part of it. Jake didn't like the spotlight. He refused to have his name listed anywhere. After retiring from field work, he went completely off-grid, opened a tiny self-defense school out in the Mojave, taught tactical combat to a select group of military contractors and federal agents, never civilians. He was paranoid, secretive. I was one of the only outsiders he ever trained. The room listened, spellbound. Gere had dropped into the conversation like a meteor, and every word coming out of his mouth deepened the crater. "Why didn't you say any of that before?" Greg asked, turning to Alex. "Why lie like you did?" Alex looked down at the mat, cheeks burning. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. I've never even met my uncle. He died before I was born. But my mom used to tell me stories. Said he was a legend. The way she talked about him, it was like he was Superman. So I guess I want to sound like I belonged here. Like maybe some of that was in me too." There was silence for a moment. Then Greg exhaled. His body relaxed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Kid, you don't need to make up stories to belong. If your uncle was the man Gere says he was, then fine. But that doesn't make you anything. You earn your place in this gym by showing up, by getting hit, by bleeding, and by getting back up. Not by dropping names. Understand?" Alex nodded. "Yes, sir." Gere smiled faintly. "He's right, Alex. Your uncle didn't talk about who he was. He didn't need to. Real strength is quiet." Greg turned to Gere. "So what brings you here?" Gere grinned. "Well, I've been traveling. Doing some soul-searching, you might say. Thought about a new project involving combat trauma and redemption. But mostly, I just wanted to see this gym. Jake used to talk about you, Greg. Said you were the one guy who could have gone pro if you hadn't stayed to train the next generation." Greg looked genuinely stunned. He said that, word for word. The fighters around the gym murmured in surprise. Coach Greg had always been respected, but now his status had just become legendary. Greg scratched his chin. "Well, I didn't expect today to go like this." Gere chuckled. "Neither did I. But since I'm here, mind if I take a class?" That broke the tension. Laughter rippled through the room. Even Greg smiled. "You serious?" "Why not? It's been a while since I was thrown on my back." Greg motioned to the mat. "All right then, Hollywood. Let's see what you've got." For the next 30 minutes, Richard Gere trained with the gym's fighters. To his credit, he held his own, not with the aggression of a professional, but with grace, control, and surprising agility. The fighters went easy at first, unsure of how to treat a movie star in their midst, but Gere quickly proved that he wasn't there to be pampered. He took a couple of stiff falls and even pulled off a decent reversal during a grappling drill, which earned him applause. Alex watched from the sidelines, still rubbing his cheek, but now wearing a different expression, something like awe. After class, Gere approached him directly. "You know," he said, "your uncle once told me something I never forgot. He said, it's not the punches you land that make you dangerous. It's the ones you don't throw." Alex nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "I'm sorry for how I acted," Alex said quietly. To Coach Greg. To everyone. Gere nodded. "That's the first real thing you've said all day." Now, keep going. Greg walked over and stood beside Gere, folding his arms. We'll see if you show up tomorrow. If you do, you train like everyone else. No talk. No shortcuts. I will, Alex said. And no more uncle stories, Greg added. Alex grinned sheepishly. No more uncle stories. The room began to empty out as the fighters collected their gear and headed home. Some snapped discreet photos of Gere before leaving, still processing the surreal experience. As the gym lights dimmed, Greg and Gere stood alone on the mat. I never thought I'd see you in my gym, Greg admitted. I never thought I'd want to fight again, Gere replied. Greg nodded toward Alex, who was mopping the mats in the corner. Think the kid has it in him? Gere tilted his head thoughtfully. Too early to tell, but he's got something to prove. That's usually where it starts. Greg smiled. Then we'll see what he's made of. Gere extended his hand, and Greg shook it firmly. Tell me something, Greg asked before Gere could leave. Why now? Why come here today? Gere looked toward the old trophy wall, faded and cluttered with years of forgotten victories. Because I was tired of pretending to be tough. I wanted to see what real looked like again. Greg nodded. He understood that better than most. And as Richard Gere disappeared through the same door he'd entered, leaving behind a stunned Jim and a humbled teenager, Coach Greg turned back to the mat. The day had started with a lie, exploded into confrontation, and ended in something no one could have predicted: truth, humility, and maybe even the beginning of redemption. 3 weeks had passed since Richard Gere walked into the gym, since Coach Greg slapped a teenage boy for running his mouth, and since a half-lie turned into a legacy. The gym hadn't been the same since. The story had gone semi-viral. Not because someone filmed it, Greg had a strict no-recording policy, but because the fighters who witnessed it told the tale with a reverence usually reserved for folklore. Richard Gere showed up, grappled with Coach Greg, and told us the kid's uncle really did train Navy SEALs. They'd say, swear to God, he rolled like a monk and hit a textbook switch from bottom guard. Smooth as silk. Greg didn't encourage the chatter, but he didn't stop it either. He understood that stories were part of the culture. Just like fighters earned nicknames, gyms earned legends. And now his gym, battered walls, rusty lockers, and all, had one. But amid all the talk, Alex was quietly changing. Gone was the kid who boasted about invisible military camps and secret agents. In his place was someone who showed up early, stayed late, and didn't say a damn thing unless it was to ask a question. He cleaned the mats. He helped newer students with their raps. And when he sparred, he kept his chin tucked and his mouth shut. That slap had knocked the ego out of him, and what grew back in its place was something much harder to find: discipline. Greg had been watching him closely. Every gym had its share of flashes in the pan. Kids who trained hard for 2 weeks, then vanished when they didn't see results. But Alex? He stayed. One afternoon, after drills, Greg approached him. You ever actually fight, kid? Alex looked up, sweat pouring down his face. Not officially, just scraps in school. Greg nodded. You're not ready, but you might be soon. You got a good base. Solid footwork. Tough chin. Alex smiled for the first time in days. Thank you, coach. Don't thank me, Greg replied. You still talk too much in your head. Learn to be quiet in there. That's when things start making sense. Meanwhile, Richard Gere hadn't disappeared. Despite his brief visit, he sent over a signed copy of a book, The Art of Peace by Morihei Ueshiba, with a note tucked inside. To Alex, your uncle was a warrior. But the world needs more than warriors now. It needs students. Greg framed it and hung it in the locker room. No one touched it, but everyone read it. And over time, the gym adopted a new vibe. The talk died down, the training sharpened. The fighters, old and young, had absorbed something intangible. Not celebrity, not fame, but something quieter. Presence. Legacy. Then one day, about a month later, a black Escalade pulled into the gravel lot outside the gym. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled long after the vehicle came to a stop. Greg noticed it immediately. His instincts, honed from both the military and the ring, told him that something was off. He stepped outside, towel slung over his shoulder, and squinted into the sun. The door opened. A tall, lean man stepped out, dressed in all black. Aviators. Buzz cut. No nonsense. "Coach Greg," he asked. "That's me," Greg said. He didn't offer his hand. The man nodded. "My name's Commander Brett Klein. I served with Jake Thompson." Greg's jaw tightened. "You're a long way from any base." Klein gave a small, humorless smile. "I've been hearing things. About a kid talking about Jake. About Richard Gere dropping names. About this gym." Greg said nothing. Klein continued. "Jake didn't want to be remembered. He didn't want stories told. He believed in silence. In erasure. I didn't know him personally," Greg said. "But from what I've gathered, he made an impression." Klein stepped closer. "He was a ghost. A myth for a reason. You don't bring ghosts into the light. You don't build shrines to them." Greg crossed his arms. "No shrine here. Just a kid trying to find something to stand on." Klein looked past him, into the gym. Through the window, Alex was drilling takedowns. "That him?" Greg nodded. "Yeah, that's Jake's nephew." Klein sighed. "I'm not here to intimidate anyone. I'm here because I don't want that kid chasing a shadow." Jake didn't want followers. He wanted the next generation to find their own way. If the kid wants to fight, let him fight. But don't let him think he's walking in Jake's footsteps. No one is. Greg stared at the man for a long moment, then nodded. Message received. Klein stepped back toward the SUV, then paused. "But if he ever wants to meet someone who knew Jake, have him come to the base. I'll make time. He deserves to know what kind of man his uncle really was. The whole picture." Greg raised an eyebrow. "That an invitation or a warning?" Klein gave the faintest smile. "Depends on the kid." The Escalade pulled away, leaving dust and silence in its wake. That night, Greg sat down with Alex in the office. "You ever want to meet someone who knew your uncle?" Alex's eyes widened. "Like who?" "Commander Brett Klein. Says he served with him. He stopped by today." Alex leaned forward. "What did he say?" Greg looked at him carefully. "He said Jake didn't want to be remembered. He wanted you to find your own path. You think you're ready for that?" Alex was quiet. Then he nodded. "I think so." Greg smiled. "Good, because you've got your first amateur fight in 4 weeks." Alex blinked. "What?" "You've been training. You kept your head down. Time to see if you can take a punch and keep going." "I don't know if I'm ready. No one ever is. But you'll know when you're in the cage." The next 4 weeks were brutal. Greg didn't ease up. He pushed Alex like he did the others. Hard sparring, intense cardio, wrestling clinics, painful striking drills. And to his credit, Alex never once asked to slow down. He was finding his rhythm. It wasn't that he was the most talented fighter. He wasn't. But he had grit, and he listened. That made him dangerous. The night of the fight, the venue was a grimy local hall with sweat-stained mats and folding chairs. The crowd was drunk, rowdy, and hungry for blood. Greg had been here 100 times before. For Alex, it was his first war. He sat in the locker room, hands wrapped, heart pounding. "You nervous?" Greg asked. Alex nodded. "Terrified." "Good. Means you're awake." "What if I lose?" Greg smirked. "Then you get up and train again. But if you quit mid-round, don't bother coming back." Alex stared at the floor. "Understood." They walked to the cage. The announcer barely got his name right. The crowd didn't care who he was. But when the bell rang, Alex moved like someone who finally had something real to defend. His opponent was faster, stronger, threw heavier shots. But Alex stayed in the pocket. He slipped. He jabbed. He bled. Then, in the second round, he saw an opening. He faked low, came over the top with a looping right, and connected clean. The crowd roared. His opponent stumbled. Alex moved in, clinched, threw knees, took the back, rear naked choke, tap. It was over. The cage door opened. Greg stepped in. For the first time, he smiled, not a polite nod, but a real smile. He lifted Alex's hand in victory. "You earned that," he said. Alex's eyes welled up. "Thank you, coach." After the fight, while they packed up in the locker room, Greg handed him a folded note. Alex opened it. Inside, in careful handwriting, were the words, "You're not him. That's the good news. Richard Gere." And in the dusty halls of a forgotten MMA gym, where ghosts once whispered and movie stars rolled with warriors, a new fighter was born. Not because of who his uncle was, but because he learned how to show up.